The deadliest civil war in human history was not fought in Europe. It was not fought in the United States. It killed between 20 and 30 million people across China in the middle of the 19th century, and almost nobody in the West has heard of it. The war was called the Taiping Rebellion, and it lasted for 14 years, reshaped a continent, and produced casualty numbers that exceeded the entire death toll of the First World War. You are about to find out what happened, why it has been forgotten, and how a Chinese village teacher nearly toppled an empire. If you have ever wondered which conflict caused the most death and suffering in a single country, the answer is sitting buried inside Chinese history. The Qing Dynasty was ruling China at the time. The country was already struggling with foreign pressure, opium addiction, and weak governance. Into that environment walked a man named Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil service candidate who had spent years convinced he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. His belief, combined with the desperation of the rural Chinese poor, lit a fire that almost burned the empire down. Here is how the war actually began. Hong Xiuquan had a vision after failing his imperial examinations. He came to believe that he had been chosen by God to overthrow the Qing rulers and establish a new kingdom on earth, which he called the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. He gathered followers in southern China, mostly poor peasants and laborers who had nothing to lose. Within a few years, his movement had grown from a handful of believers into an army of hundreds of thousands. You should understand what made this rebellion different from earlier uprisings. Hong's movement was not just a peasant revolt. It carried a complete ideology. It promised land reform. It outlawed opium. It banned the binding of women's feet. It taught a strange hybrid of Christianity, Confucian ethics, and military discipline. For millions of Chinese who had been crushed by poverty, drug addiction, and corrupt officials, the message felt like the first real hope in a generation. Stay with this, because the speed of the rebellion's success caught everyone off guard. By 1853, just a few years after the movement began, Hong's forces had captured the major city of Nanjing and turned it into their capital. They renamed it the Heavenly Capital. They executed Qing officials. They redistributed property. They built their own government with ministers, courts, and a strict moral code. At its peak, the Taiping Kingdom controlled a population larger than that of most European countries. Now picture what life looked like inside that kingdom. The rulers banned alcohol, gambling, and opium. They enforced strict separation between men and women, even between married couples. They required all subjects to recite Taiping prayers. They created a calendar that rejected the traditional Chinese system. The discipline was harsh, the religious fervor was constant, and the population was caught between the ferocity of the new rulers and the brutality of the old empire that was trying to reclaim them. Here is something most people never learn about this war. The casualty numbers are staggering not because of single battles, but because of the scale of starvation, displacement, and disease that followed every campaign. Entire regions were depopulated, farmland was abandoned. Refugees flooded the countryside in numbers that overwhelmed any local government's ability to respond. The dead piled up in cities and villages faster than anyone could bury them, and outbreaks of cholera and other diseases finished off what the fighting had started. You should know how the Qing Dynasty fought back. The imperial army was weak, corrupt, and badly equipped. The rulers in Beijing knew their regular forces could not defeat the Taiping, so they turned to a Confucian scholar named Zhang Gofan, who built a regional army from scratch using volunteers, strict discipline, and personal loyalty rather than imperial authority. Zhang's army eventually became the most effective fighting force in China, and his methods reshaped how the country thought about military organization for the next century. Stay with this, because Western powers also played a role that gets overlooked in most retellings. British and French forces had recently fought their own wars against China during the Opium Wars. They had every reason to want the Qing weakened. But the Taiping Christian theology was so strange to Western missionaries that European powers ended up backing the Qing instead. British officers helped train Chinese imperial troops. European weapons flowed into the imperial side. The same Western powers that had been humiliating the Qing months earlier suddenly became their reluctant allies against the rebels. Now consider how the rebellion finally collapsed. The Taiping leadership turned on itself in a series of internal purges and assassinations. Hong Xiuquan retreated from active leadership and grew increasingly disconnected from reality. His ministers fought for power. His armies stretched too far from their supply lines. The Qing, with Western help, slowly tightened their grip around the heavenly capital. The siege of Nanjing in 1864 ended with the city's fall, and Hong died shortly before the final collapse, possibly from poisoning or illness. The exact cause remains disputed today. Here is what happened in the years after. China lost more people in this conflict than in any other single event in its history. Vast regions of the country took decades to recover. The Qing Dynasty survived the rebellion, but emerged so weakened that its eventual fall in 1911 was already inevitable. The political, economic, and demographic shock of the war shaped Chinese history for the next century, and many modern historians argue that the Taiping Rebellion was the true beginning of the end for Imperial China. You should also know why this war has been so thoroughly forgotten in the West. The conflict happened at the same time as the American Civil War, which dominated English-language history books. The events in China were considered too distant and too strange for most European readers. The Taiping ideology, which mixed Christianity with elements that horrified Western missionaries, did not fit into any simple narrative, so the war was filed away as an obscure Asian conflict and largely ignored by the broader historical conversation. Stay with this for one more beat, because the rebellion left fingerprints on modern history that almost nobody traces back to it. The military reforms that came out of the war shaped the warlord era of the early 20th century. The destruction of the king's authority opened space for the revolutionary movements that eventually produced both the Republic of China and the People's Republic. Mao Zedong himself studied the Taiping Rebellion closely and drew lessons from its successes and failures. The shadow of this forgotten war runs through every major event in Chinese politics from then until now. Now think about what this means for how we understand history. The deadliest civil war in human history happened within living memory of events that every Western student studies in detail. The same generation that fought at Gettysburg watched a far larger conflict unfold across China, and almost nobody outside Asia paid attention. The gap between what gets remembered and what gets forgotten is not random. It reflects whose history was being written, by whom, and for which audience,